This is Anything for You. Sweet Haven Farm, Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 4. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 2. Chapter 3. The man wouldn't leave. He was actually a help, if Jillian were being honest. But she wanted to run her hands over Heidi, checking her and making sure she was okay. She wanted to get her cell phone and call David, her cousin who owned the zoo in Mexico where Heidi and Hazel went when the circus dissolved. She needed to call Carlos, the man who could supply her with whatever fake papers she needed. Whoever brought Heidi probably didn't have papers. Nothing legit, anyway. Mexicans didn't always understand America's endless need for reams of paper, nor their need to constantly prove legality of something. The water trough was almost full, and she opened her mouth to ask McCoy to shut it off, but he was already moving. She ran her hand over Heidi's rough skin. "Come on, sweetheart. I'm sure you're thirsty." She splashed the water a little, not much, lest Heidi think they were playing the splashing game. "It's too cold here most of the time to do that." Heidi loved the sound of her voice, so she spoke just to keep her calm. She was definitely going to have to talk to Fink and Ellie tonight after the barn was cleaned up, after McCoy left. She had too many secrets for her to be getting buddy-buddy with a government worker, especially one that played by the rules. He came back and stood with his hands on his hips. It wasn't right for a man to smell as good as he did. Some kind of earthy, spicy, masculine scent that twisted her insides. Her brow furrowed. Maybe a little eucalyptus oil in there too. Which was weird, since she hadn't caught that earlier when they were dancing. "I appreciate your help," she said, and tried not to sound as grudging as she felt. "It's obvious you've worked with elephants," he said. Was that the first nice thing he'd said to her? "For almost 20 years. She bit her tongue. She didn't want him to dig too deeply into her background. "In the circus?" "Yes." "Which one?" "A small family circus." He waited. She wasn't going to speak to fill the silence, so he could just keep on waiting. He gave up first. "I'm going back up. I'm on cleanup duty. That'll be starting here soon." "I have the same duty." She hadn't thought he'd be helping, but she should have known. "I'll be up shortly." "Be careful. It's getting dark." Like she couldn't see. He hesitated. Maybe he didn't want to leave her alone, but he finally turned and left, to her relief. The dog catcher was not her friend. She didn't have a normal ladder to reach the spot above Heidi's ears that she loved to have scratched, and Heidi wasn't wearing her bright pink harness that Jillian could grab and use to climb up. But it wasn't hard to find a pole she could climb. Kicking off her heels, she scaled it easily. It was a little trickier to hold the overhead beam with her hands and toes and work herself backward until she was over Heidi. Letting go with her feet, she slowly settled onto Heidi's back and, letting go of the beam and leaning forward, scratched her ears. Her dress was ruined, no doubt. "Who brought you here, and why?" she whispered. "How'd they get you here? And what am I supposed to do with you? Not that I'm not thrilled that you're here. I've missed you so much." But she didn't have the money to feed an elephant. She didn't have the money to feed herself. Everything she was making was going to pay the coyote who facilitated her passage across the border. It didn't matter that she'd almost died in the desert. She still owed him several $1,000s. And she still owed Carlos a cool $3,000 for bringing her up and getting her papers, a fake Social Security card and a fake work visa. They weren't real, but they were all she had. Her mother always said her father was an American. Jillian believed it, since she got her height from her father's side of the family, and her mother had given her his last name, Powell. So technically she was a dual citizen of Mexico and America. But her father wasn't listed on her birth certificate. So even though she should be an American citizen, she wasn't. Not with the missing name. Which stunk, because she'd almost bet the farm that in order to get a permit for Heidi, she needed to be a real citizen. An hour later, she'd changed into clean jeans and boots, thrown her hair into a ponytail, and had bolstered her courage to work alongside McCoy. Ellie and Fink and their kids would be there, so he probably wouldn't grill her. She wasn't going to mention Heidi until after McCoy left. Hopefully, he'd not mention her either. But no such luck. She walked into the barn where a few guests still milled about. The musicians were packing things up. McCoy and Fink had their heads bent together and were deep in conversation. Her lips pressed together. Maybe they were talking about something different, but she somehow doubted it. She greeted some of her friends and neighbors on her way over to where Fink and McCoy stood, and stopped to talk to several. It was a good 20 minutes until she made it across the room in time to hear Fink say, "Well, I don't know what we're going to do with it." She put her hands on her hips. Her chest felt hot. Why couldn't McCoy have kept his mouth shut? "How about you let me figure that out?" She glared at McCoy so he'd have no doubt about how she felt about him. Both men's heads turned slowly toward her. They stared. Something that felt an awful lot like a container of night crawlers squirmed in her stomach. "You weren't talking about the elephant, were you?" she asked in a much less assertive tone. Fink's brows shot up, almost smacking into the lights that were hanging from the ceiling. McCoy's lip pulled back. "No," he said. "We weren't." "Oh." "We," Fink emphasized the we, looking at McCoy, "we're talking about the resort that we're going to begin construction on. We're waiting on one more permit, and when Avery and Gator come back, we're going to break ground." McCoy crossed his arms over his chest. He was almost smirking. "And I don't know what we're going to do with the dirt we're going to have to move," Fink finished. "Now, what's this about an elephant?" Jillian pursed her lips. She hadn't wanted to talk about it now, but she was the one who'd just put her foot in her mouth. "One of the elephants I used to work with at the circus is currently below us in the big pen. I don't know how she got here or why or anything other than I'm sure it's Heidi." Fink, poor guy, looked a little shell-shocked, but Ellie had come over and put her arm around him. "Did you just say there was an elephant below us?" she asked. "Yes." "Oh, wow. The boys are going to love this." "We'd better not tell them tonight," Fink said quickly, looking around, presumably for his rambunctious offspring. "You're probably right, as always, dear," Ellie said with a bit of a glint in her eye. Jillian suspected Ellie wouldn't tell the boys, but she'd be below in the barn herself, checking out the elephant. Jillian had opened her mouth to offer to take Ellie down. Heidi was sweet and calm, but she was upset over her move and more than likely missing her sister. She probably wouldn't get violent, but Jillian would feel horrible if she did. But Fink beat her to speech. "I can see what you're thinking, and no, Absolutely not. Ellie's eyes widened. What? She tilted her head. Ellie had definitely perfected the totally innocent look. You want to go see the elephant, Fink stated with a glower. Ellie blinked. Oh, honey, what a great idea! I'd just love to. She moved closer and smiled sweetly up into Fink's face. You'll come with me, right? I'll take you both down if you want, Jillian offered. Let's wait until after we have this cleaned up and the boys are in bed, Fink suggested, obviously no match for his wife's feminine wiles. Okay, honey. Ellie grinned, and Fink put a hand up and cupped her cheek for a moment. Jillian started to move off, but Fink's voice stopped her. Don't you need a permit or something for that? Yes, I do. I'll have to look into getting something tomorrow. She chomped on the gum that McCoy had given her. Is it okay for us to keep her, at least until I can figure something out? She'd love to keep her for real, but she wasn't under any delusions that she'd be able to afford it. Plus, surely Heidi would want to be somewhere other than stuffed under someone's barn. As long as we're not breaking any laws, that's fine. He gave McCoy a look. I'll actually have to look the particulars up. I don't deal with elephants very often. McCoy shrugged. Fink and Ellie smiled. You do that and let us know. In the meantime, I'm sure Jillian will know how to take care of her. Is it going to be too cold for her tonight? Jillian chomped harder. I don't know. Well, if we need to, she can go down to the training room in the dog kennel. There's plenty of room there. You'll just have to clean it up in the morning. Thanks, Jillian said. She hadn't thought of that. They'd converted an old shed into dog kennels, with kennels and dog doors all around the outside. On the inside area of the building, there was a big room that she used for the dog obedience classes that she just started a few months ago. The floor was cement with a big drain in the middle. It would be easy to clean and disinfect. That's what they'd designed it for. She looked over to see McCoy studying her. His dark blue gaze made her want to squirm, but she didn't allow herself that luxury. She'd hoped to hide things from him, knew she'd still have to, and he wasn't the kind of man who would let things slide. He'd play by the rule book. Unfortunately, she might not be able to do that. She needed him on her side. She touched her tongue to her lip and gave him her coyest smile. He blinked. Exactly the reaction she was going for. Now she needed to see his cow eyes. Except, instead of his eyes glazing over and his brain going on hiatus, his eyes narrowed, his lips pressed together. She yanked her eyes away. Typical government employee. If she had the money, she could bribe him. Otherwise, she'd be on his hit list. She grew up skirting the edges of Mexican law. She could handle one little dog catcher in Pennsylvania. The next morning, McCoy walked into the kitchen wearing a pair of gym shorts. The sky was just starting to lighten with the promise of the sunrise. Uncle Roy already had the coffee brewing. He sat at the table with the morning paper, his glasses perched on his nose, and his dogs, two scruffy mixed breeds, whining at his feet. "Morning, old man," McCoy said as he grabbed his coffee mug from the cupboard. "Morning, whippersnapper," Uncle Roy said without looking up from the paper. It was their standard greeting every morning he was home. He poured a cup of coffee. He drank it black. He shuffled to the door. "I'm taking your dogs out." "Wait," Uncle Roy barked. McCoy froze with his hand on the doorknob. "Yeah?" Usually, Uncle Roy barely communicated until he'd had 2 cups of coffee and read the paper, every word, including the comics, especially the comics, from front to back. "Twisty said to make them sit before you let them out." "Oh?" McCoy said. Twisty was some old neighbor lady who checked on Uncle Roy when McCoy was out of town. Sometimes she even came on days when he was working in the area. Apparently, she was a drill sergeant with dogs. He wouldn't know since he'd never met her. "Yeah," Uncle Roy said. "Sit," he barked out. McCoy hid a smile. Uncle Roy wouldn't speak softly when a shout would do. But to McCoy's surprise, both mutts put their butts on the floor. Maybe Twisty knew what she was doing. He'd like to meet her, and he'd told Uncle Roy as much, but some people were put off by his job, and he figured that maybe she was one of those. "Now you reward them by letting them out," Uncle Roy said as he rubbed his mustache. McCoy opened the back door. "Okay, guys." That's all it took, and the dogs leaped up, bounding out into the large fenced yard. Standing on the porch, leaning against the post, McCoy watched the sun explode in color and slowly fade as the sun peeked over the mountain. By the time he made it back in, Uncle Roy was just folding up the paper. "I picked some of these up yesterday when I was out." McCoy put a couple of over 55 living brochures on the table. Uncle Roy looked at them, then shook his head. "Not interested. None of them will let me take my dogs." "It's up to you, but if I don't get this promotion at work, my traveling schedule is not going to slow down. If anything, I might end up getting transferred, which could be even worse. I'd only be able to come home on the weekends when I'm not on call." "Don't go borrowing trouble. There's no reason for you not to get the promotion." "I'm not the only one qualified." And he definitely wasn't the one pursuing the promotion the most aggressively. "It's not a given." "I know, but I'm not going to think like that. I want to stay here, so I'm just going to plan on it." Uncle Roy fixed his lips in that stubborn set that McCoy easily recognized. Any time he'd ever needed corrected during his growing up years, that's the lip set he'd see. "Plus," Uncle Roy said, crossing his arms over his chest and leaning back in his chair, "Twisty will take care of me. I already told her she could move in." McCoy blinked. He'd bought the house from Uncle Roy several years ago. He didn't get too bent out of shape when Uncle Roy wanted things done a certain way, acting like he still owned the house. McCoy didn't really care whether the daffodils they planted were white or yellow, or, to be honest, whether they even planted daffodils. But inviting someone to move in? "I thought she lived in the neighborhood." Their house stood on the outskirts of Love. He'd assumed that Twisty, whoever she was, lived in town or somewhere close. "She does, and she has a job where she lives, but I know if I needed her to move, she'd bunk in our spare room. She's not picky." McCoy snorted. A woman who wasn't picky? Now that he needed to see to believe. He'd bet Twisty would have an opinion on the color of the daffodils. She'd want the toilet paper hung a certain way, too. He'd have to finally fix that leaky faucet. His sisters had never been satisfied and always looked out for the next new thing. His mom, too, apparently, since she left his dad for someone new and exotic. His fiancée had found someone more exciting, too. If he wasn't careful, he could end up getting kicked out of his own home. Chapter 4. Jillian put her head down on her small, apartment-sized table. First thing Monday morning, she'd tried to see about the permit, and she'd been right. In order to apply for a permit, a person had to be a United States citizen. She'd had plenty of experience with elephants, which was another requirement, but she didn't really have anyone who would be a witness to it. She supposed she could get a hold of her cousins in Mexico, but since the circus had been put out of business, they'd lost touch. Still, family was family, at least in Mexico. In America, not so much. But she couldn't complain, because her claim to being related to Ellie's deceased husband's family was dubious at best and relied heavily on word of mouth, since his name had never made it onto her birth certificate. She pushed the papers aside and grabbed her cell phone. Carlos was in her contacts. She pulled him up and left a message about needing fake papers for her elephant. Hopefully, he'd be able to do his job and figure out exactly what she needed. She'd fed her dogs and Heidi. She had some time before her first private obedience lesson, so she grabbed her headphones and headed out for a jog. There wasn't much happening at the Christmas tree office this time of year, and there were no cars there. It wasn't far from Fink and Ellie's house, where Ellie was probably dreaming up decorations for this fall while Fink and their 3 boys were in school. The drive was gravel and her feet crunched into the stones until she hit the blacktop road and kicked her speed up a notch. It was early, not quite 8, and the cool spring air felt refreshing on her face. Her problems with Heidi, with owing the coyote who'd helped her across the border, with owing for her ride from Arizona, not getting a permit, and McCoy's impending visit all wanted to run in a loop around her head. But she shoved them aside. Her jog was about relieving her worries, not reliving them. She searched for something pleasant to think about. McCoy's blue eyes came into her mind. The short blonde hair, the broad shoulders. How he'd helped her instead of giving her a hard time. The way his eyes had darkened when she danced in his arms. Maybe she'd better think of something else. They weren't friends and were quite likely to end up enemies before everything was said and done. Mrs. Stewart, who lived in the first house on the outskirts of Love, was out on her porch in her pink housecoat. Jillian waved as she jogged by. Mrs. Stewart called out a greeting. The neighbors tolerated Jillian, but like many small towns, were distrustful of strangers. Rightly so in some cases. Jillian had heard some of them talking about her not being quite right. She supposed that anyone who'd grown up in the circus would not be quite right. Maybe the circus would still be performing, but they couldn't afford the bribes the government workers were charging. There were also issues with drugs, although Jillian had stayed far away from that. Bribes and drugs were both big problems in Mexico. Here in America, it was papers. Papers for her, papers for Heidi, papers to do pretty much anything. If she had to choose between bribes and drugs, or papers, she supposed the papers were the lesser evil. Not by much. Uncle Roy had Chatty and Bubbles on leashes, and from the look of it was attempting to practice the obedience lessons she'd been giving him. She slowed to a walk. Chatty had wrapped her leash around his legs, while Bubbles jumped up on Uncle Roy's knees. Normally, she didn't jog on Mondays, since she had obedience clients in the morning, so Uncle Roy's mouth dropped when he looked up and saw her. "Twisty," he called. "Gotta help me, girl. These beasts are getting the best of me." "I'm coming, Uncle Roy." She opened the gate on the white picket fence and slipped through. With the fence and the big branchy maple in the front yard, the wide, comfortable-looking front porch and fenced backyard, Uncle Roy had the house of her little girl dreams. Her big girl dreams consisted of a house that was paid for. She didn't give a flip what it looked like. although the white with green shutters would have been her favorite.
Dogs are pack animals, Uncle Roy. You have to be clear about who is in charge.
I was trying until this confounded thing wrapped his leash around my legs. Chatty was a girl, but she didn't bother to correct him. She put her hands on her hips as she approached, then took one hand and lifted it like she was pressing down. Both dogs laid their ears down and sat. Jillian reached around his leg and untangled the leash, petting Chatty on her little white head while she did so. "It's a miracle every time you do that." His words made Jillian's lips quirk up. Uncle Roy was real. There was no pretense in him. Sure, he was a little louder than a person had to be, but he spoke his mind, which could sometimes be a bad thing, except Uncle Roy almost always had good things spinning in his brain.
They just need to know you're the pack leader.
I think you won that election.
Then you're my vice leader.
I showed my nephew the trick you taught me. Jillian fingered the leash in her hand.
Which trick?
The one where I make them sit before he takes them out.
Oh, yeah? Was he impressed?
Sure was. I told him you were going to move in. Jillian couldn't imagine that went over well, although she wasn't sure what kind of man lived with his uncle at his age. He was out of school and worked a job with unusual hours, so she figured he had to be at least 23 or 24.
I can't move in, Uncle Roy. I have my dogs to take care of.
And now an elephant, too. I told you, you can use my car. Jillian had been teaching Chatty to weave in and out between her hands and feet as she did slow cartwheels. She practiced it now.
Your nephew will think I'm taking advantage of you.
He wants to put me in a home. Jillian happened to be upside down on her hands. Her look probably wasn't as effective that way.
Your nephew seems like he spoils you.
I'm telling you, he's gone a lot and he wants me in a home. And I can't take my dogs to any of those places. Not to mention they stink.
Can't argue with that,
Jillian muttered, back on her feet. Chatty was doing great. She wasn't sure what kind of mixed breeds the dogs were, but they were both fairly easy to train. They were both the right size and would have made excellent circus performers. But that part of her life was over. So why was she teaching Chatty tricks? Do the handstand one, Uncle Roy said.
You might have to help still, she said before she bent over in a handstand.
From that angle, the house looked huge. Bending her legs and back, she stretched until one foot was almost to the ground.
Hop on, Chatty, she said.
Chatty was the better behaved of the two, usually, and she stepped up on Jillian's ankle. Jillian slowly straightened her leg, and Chatty adjusted her position until Jillian's leg was straight up, and Chatty was perched on the bottom of her sneaker. Jillian lowered her other leg the same way, and Bubbles actually climbed on herself. A few seconds later, Jillian was on her hands with both dogs perched on the bottoms of her sneakers. They did it, the old man shouted, without any help. He did a fist pump. She turned her head slightly to give Uncle Roy an upside-down smile when movement caught her eye and she straightened her head. Blonde with a square jaw. She didn't have any trouble recognizing the man who stepped out on the porch, but her brain didn't want to accept it. Of course, the next time she saw McKoy Rodning would be when she was upside down with two dogs perched on her feet. Lovely. Coming down, she said. They had some other things they did occasionally, but she was done with tricks. Something about the serious look on his face, Or maybe it was the olive green uniform that broadened his shoulders and emphasized his muscular legs. Or the black boots that were braced apart on the porch. Or the way he had his hands crossed over his chest. Whatever it was, it gave Jillian the idea that he wasn't amused. The audience was not getting their money's worth. And she was wrong about the age of Uncle Roy's nephew. McCoy must be almost 30. His look had made her a little weak in the elbows, but she managed to get her feet on the ground and straighten up without dumping the dogs or herself on the grass. She cleared her throat, not sure what to say. "Let me guess, Uncle Roy. This is Twisty." His voice was low, maybe a little annoyed. "Sure is. I didn't know you were watching." Uncle Roy turned to McCoy with a big grin. "She sure is something, isn't she?" Jillian frantically tried to remember what all she'd told Uncle Roy. Hopefully, he didn't decide to spill her life story. Had she told him she was in a circus in Mexico? She didn't want McCoy to start wondering if she were a legal citizen.
"I have a class soon. Gotta run."
She threw a quick wave at Uncle Roy. "Hey, wait! I want to introduce you to my nephew." "We've met." McCoy's voice was flat.
"We were in the wedding together on Saturday."
Jillian felt she had to explain. She wasn't sure what that hooded look of McCoy's meant. "I should have gone, but I didn't want to miss bingo." Uncle Roy patted Chatty's head. McCoy crossed his arms over his chest. "You mean you didn't want to miss Bertha Windot's lemon cookies?" "Those two." Uncle Roy winked at Jillian. She had to smile. The man was sweet, and he loved his dogs. That showed a lot about a person's character, in her opinion.
"Well, I better be getting on."
"Take care," Uncle Roy called. Jillian couldn't help but notice that McCoy didn't call anything out as she left. It was almost like he was angry with her. But she didn't do anything. They'd not really spoken Saturday night as they'd helped clean up, so nothing had changed. Unless he'd somehow discovered the truth about her. But he couldn't have. It wasn't like her name was in his computer with a big black X beside it, alerting everyone that she didn't belong here. She jogged along the sidewalk of love until she came to the post office. Taking a small breather, she walked back and forth along the steps until she could head in without panting. "Jillian Powell, I figured you'd be in this morning." Love's postmistress, Janie Davis, bustled behind the counter. She had a pin stuck in her hair and her glasses on a chain around her neck. Jillian nodded.
"It's a nice morning. It's about time we get some decent weather around here. It's been winter for about 5 years, or seems like it anyway," Janie said. "My fingers are getting itchy to get to digging in the ground."
"Yeah." Jillian didn't have that affliction, but she didn't want to get into a moral argument about the superiority of people who worked the ground versus people who didn't, so she kept her expression bland.
"I heard tell there were some strange noises coming from the barn basement on Saturday."
Janie had put her glasses on her face as she flipped letters in her hand, and now she peered over them.
"Some folks in here are already this morning saying that the old barn is haunted."
Her voice lowered, and she said haunted with a special shiver in her voice. Janie fixed a level stare on Jillian. Jillian pulled her show face, the one she used when someone else was performing.
"Oh, I hadn't heard anything."
Janie pursed her lips and waited another few seconds before looking back down and continuing to sort the mail.
"But I did hear the wedding was nice." "It was. Beautiful. And Avery and Gator are so happy.
Jillian was happy for them, too. Maybe a small part of her longed to have what they had. McCoy's face popped into her head. Not with him. He could barely stand to look at her. There was no way she would have a happily ever after with him. Not to mention, since he was such a play-by-the-book kind of man, he wouldn't want to have anything to do with her anyway, other than making sure she was taking proper care of Heidi and that she had all the right confounded permits and papers. Ugh.
I heard they fixed that old barn up pretty nice.
Janie had their bundle of mail, but she didn't act like she was planning on handing it over any time soon.
It was beautiful,
Jillian said.
You're putting on a show for Wildlife Days in town, so I hear. Yes, Mr. Peachy suggested I sign up to give a demonstration on dog obedience training. And Uncle Roy offered to let me use his dogs.
Could she snatch the packet of mail without offending Janie? Probably not. Her fingers twitched, but she held them firmly on the counter.
If you can train those rangy mongrels, you can train anything,
Janie said with a shake of her head.
They're coming along really well. They should do a great job next Saturday. I'll believe it when I see it. 'Twill be good for your business if it's true.
Jillian gave her a friendly smile. If she were going to grow her obedience business, she needed to court potential customers.
My demonstration is at 1 in the afternoon on the library lawn. Make sure you come see it.
So, Janie tapped the mail on the counter.
My daughter-in-law has a golden retriever that won't get housebroke. She piddles on the kitchen floor every night. You handle things like that in your dog training business? Or do you just do tricks?
Jillian's lips pressed together, but she didn't let the annoyed words out of her mouth. She waited until she could smile pleasantly.
I absolutely can help her house train her dog. I'll tell her. Sure. Tell her to give me a call and we'll set something up.
Jillian couldn't help the happy little thrill that skipped down her backbone. If she could get Janie's daughter's dog trained and make them happy, Janie would be about the best advertising she could hope for. Pretty much everyone in town stopped at the post office. That could really help her business. When she'd come over from Mexico, she'd planned on a housekeeping job, but that fell through. But things were working out well. Fink and Ellie had taken her under their wing and had treated her better than she'd ever expected. Of course, she'd helped them when they were having a hard time as well. Still, she needed to send money to the Coyote. Most of them were involved in drugs, and she didn't want to get on their hit list. Janie finally handed over her mail. Jillian jogged down the steps and headed down the road that would loop her back to the farm, with two main things on her mind: expanding her dog training business so she could get the Coyote paid, and getting something figured out about Heidi and keeping McCoy satisfied until she did. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great Jessie Gussman audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.